Hi, my name is Didier. Welcome to the lab. We are at La Maison de Whiskey over in Paris, and today we're going to be talking about floor malting with our friends over at Stonning. Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing fine, thanks.
Okay, let's talk about floor malting. All right, so first of all, just to talk about malting in general, could you tell us what it is and why we do it?
Well, the malting process is where you actually get the grain to grow. And the reason we do that, the reason we want to have this germination going on that we see behind me here, is that we want the grain to convert some starch in the grain into some sugar that we later on can use for making some alcohol. There's also a lot of talking about flavor and enzymes, etc. But the main reason and what is happening is that the grain starts to grow, and during that process, during the germination, the starch inside the grain is turned into sugar that we later on can use for making alcohol.
Okay, and so why do we nearly always malt barley? Can you malt other grains? If so, why don't we?
Well, in barley you get the advantage that it has a high content of enzymes. You end up with a lot of enzymes that is necessary to have an efficient production at the end, especially when you talk about doing mashing and fermentation. You need to have those sugar that you have been made during malting being converted into some fermentable sugar, meaning that the yeast during fermentation can actually turn that sugar into alcohol. And another advantage with barley is also that it has a husk, and we can see that in Stonning that is an advantage and make barley easier to work with. For instance, if you compare it with rye, which has no husk, because the husk itself, after you have been milling it, it adds and helps you when you do the filtration in the mashing. So I guess that is another advantage that you definitely have with the barley as well. It's definitely possible to do malting of other grains than barley, and actually here in Stonning we do a lot of malting of rye. We have in our rye whiskey, all the rye that we're using, it's all been malted. All the grain actually that we're using here in Stonning whiskey, it's all been malted here at our at the distillery.
And so you have a really original malted rye whiskey. Could you tell us what are the challenges with malting rye as opposed to barley? And what does the malting actually bring flavor-wise to the rye?
Well, again, the main difference and the main challenge that we have when malting rye compared to malting barley is that it's getting more sticky because it has no husk to it. It absorbs the moist much more rapidly, much faster. So during the steeping process, you really need to be careful adding the water so you don't get too high in the percentage of moist content in the grain. And that also makes the grain itself more sticky, so it's more tricky to handle. And also when you put it in the kiln after the germination, it's more compact. It's more of a hard layer, so it's more difficult to blow the air through that needs to dry the grain down. But I guess in the overall whiskey production, it's not the malting of rye that is the main challenges. We see more of the challenge especially first place is in the mashing, because you don't have the husk which you have in barley, so filtration is more tricky. We get a more solid in our wort, and that especially for us because we're doing direct fired pot stills. And using direct fired pot stills and a wort with a lot of solid in it, it's kind of tricky not to get those solids to be burned in during distillation. So that is the main challenge we have. But under the malting itself, I guess it's more sticky, a little more difficult to handle, and the airflow in the kiln. Well, for us that we malt the rye is an important part of the rye whiskey we make. In the beginning of Stonning whiskey, way back in the old butchery house a few kilometers that way, where we did the first testing and the first trials, we actually did some tests with unmalted and malted rye. And the conclusion was pretty clear to us that you get a more of a complexity to your final spirit if you actually malt the grain. We like to think that we get a more of a cereal note in the spirit, and also the fruitiness in the finish is long and nice. So for us, it's key, and it's very important that we actually do malting of all the rye that we're using here at Stonning Whiskey.
Okay, and now specifically about floor malting, what is the difference between the regular malting that the maltsters use and the floor malting that you guys do over at your distillery yourselves?
When you compare our malting and floor malting in general with how almost everybody is malting today, which is more commercial and more industrialized, is that the main difference is efficiency. the floor malting, as we're doing here at Downing Whisky, it is just not as efficient as it is done in a modern malting facility. And the main challenge we have is temperature control, because you see the grain here behind me that is germinating, developing heat. Controlling that heat during germination, that is just so much more tricky in floor malting, because we don't have the possibility of blowing temperature control and moist control air through the grain during germination. The only thing we can do to try to keep the temperature down so we don't damage the enzymes is that we can turn it more often, we can try to ventilate the room as good as we can, and we have some cooling hoses in the floor to try to extract some of the heat. But it is rather tricky, and it's something that you really need to take care of. And that also means that from summer to winter, the layer of grain that we are able to put on the floor is different, because in the summertime we need to have a more thin layer than we can here in winter times. And another thing that is different from floor malting at Downing Whisky, and I guess also floor malting back in the days, is that normally in the malting you do the steeping. You get the moist content up in the grain in steeping vessel as step one in malting. But here in Downing we actually do the steeping on the floor. And the reason is that we invented those turning machine you can see going on down here. And after we tried and working with those, we decided to try to add some spray nozzles, so we can actually on the floor add the water and the grain could absorb the moist getting turned the first pretty much 24 hours. And it's much easier for us to lay out an even layer of dry grain and then build up the moist content on the floor instead of working with wet grain, laying it out on the floor. And it's turned out to be actually quite a nice solution. We get a very even absorption of moist throughout the entire floor. But that's definitely very different from what you see any other place in the world.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for all those answers.
Well, you're very welcome, and have a nice day.
Thank you at home for watching. Like us if you like what you see. Follow us for more. And a little question for the comments today is about the stills over at Stauning. How many pot stills do they have at the distillery? If you think you know, put it in the comments, and we'll see you next time.